Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 43 of IGEL Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. Got my normal cast of characters here. Characters in an enduring way. For the IGEL Weekly that we do every other week, which is a community edition. And Seb, hopefully people in the community are getting some extra value out of listening to these and maybe even watching the videos from time to time. But you still getting some good feedback?
Oh yeah, definitely. More on the audio than on the video part, because most of the people are listening to it in the car, doing driving and so on, or doing some other stuff. But definitely, yes. David Prowse is doing some great advertisements for XenTegra and for the podcast. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, David's a big friend of both of ours. So Seb, you're at home there in Germany. Chris, you're on the road somewhere. You've got a virtual background. Without going into too much detail, what city, state are you in?
I'm in the awesome city of San Antonio, Texas.
Awesome city of San Antonio. Yeah, that's a good town. You go down the Riverwalk?
We did. I came in a little bit early, and what was cool is we went down. They got the Alamo there, and it turns out that this is the commemoration of the Battle of the Alamo, which was from late February into early March. And so when we approached, we heard some band playing. It was a Marine band, a jazz band actually. They were really, really talented, and it was cool. So we kind of hung out there Sunday afternoon and went down the Riverwalk and then did a tour of the Alamo and made a day of it. So it's fun.
Yeah, in the U.S. we don't think as much about borders changing, but that was a time when borders were changing rapidly.
Oh yeah, it was the whole Texas was independent. Texas wasn't even a U.S. territory technically, so there's a little history there. But yeah, and I think my grandmother grew up in Gonzales, and there's some family stuff that was involved with the Alamo some years ago, and I was trying to get some of that background. But anyway, a different time.
Different time. Yeah, we won't go too much more into that. Seb, is that a virtual background or is that your real office? I noticed you moved your hand around.
No, it's still real.
That's
it's
real.
Still real. I can, definitely.
Okay.
I cannot even say that I will travel in the next weeks at the moment. So I'm really looking forward to leave the office, to leave that virtual background behind me, and going back under normal people. But disrupt events are starting something in May in Europe, so I have some couple of weeks in front of me.
Yeah, that's good. Hopefully you guys are getting back to normal. The US is rapidly getting back to normal-ish, I think. We'll see what happens. All right, so Seb, you have for us a good topic, and I'm going to share my screen so you guys can see.
I hope so, at least.
Oh, it is for sure. The title is IGEL OS Boot Menu Explained. I literally was with someone who'd been doing IGEL for a long time, a couple weeks ago at a conference, and I needed to kind of rescue them a little bit. And I jumped into the boot menu and like, hey, what's that? And I was like, you didn't know what this was? And the answer was no. And so, having access to that is extremely valuable. Now, in that particular case, the unit that we were using was a demo unit that had been used by a very secure organization that had put a password on everything. And we couldn't get it to do what we needed it to do anyway. Our only option was to flash the device, which we didn't have, OS Creator with us at the moment. But it was really good opportunity to explain to people how secure, if you want to, you can make these things.
That's right. That one of the approaches where the boot menu can definitely help a lot. I mean, usually, and I would say for 90% of our users, of our administrators, the boot menu isn't something that you're looking for such often. Yeah. It's really in case of emergency, in case of issues, specific testings you want to perform. But usually, for all our listeners, a boot menu is something that you do not even see, like on Windows or on some Linux bootloaders. Yeah. So yes.
So Seb, you did this video. This is a vlog basically that we're reviewing. We're going to click on the video in a second, but you did this because it's been coming up in the community a lot. What's driving the chatter around this that caused you to take something that I thought was common knowledge and make a explainable video?
The reason is quite simple, hopefully, to explain. We have at the moment a high load of private builds. So private builds are not widely communicated firmwares, but fully supported by IGEL. And this private builds are including newer Citrix Workspace app versions, new Cisco WebEx, VDI agents, etc., etc. So they are created for a specific use case and then delivered to the customer. And the reason why I have to speak about the boot menu is that we have at the moment one specific firmware out, which can, in specific situations, in specific hardware situations, create a kind of bug. And that's something that a lot of people are, not a lot, but let's say a couple of people are asking at the moment how to get rid of it and to see where the device is hanging. And that's where the IGEL Boot Menu is definitely helpful, because it gives you something more than just a black screen. It gives you access to what is happening during the boot process, where in details it might hang, or even give you the access to some, let's say, custom rescue shell where you can at least roll back specific settings or even do a factory reset. So recover the device, basically.
Yeah. How yeah, like you said, it shouldn't come up. It shouldn't come up often. Chris, your 2 cents on this thing, this ability to boot into the boot menu and set your own course. Are you seeing many people doing that? Is it how does that apply to the sales engineer side of your world?
I think I reflect certainly some of what Seb had to say. I think it's sometimes, like, if you're flashing a device, and I've seen where maybe like the video or something like that isn't coming up right or whatever, and so had instructions from others, hey, try the VESA boot option, and it might be a video driver thing. Now that generally speaks to our kernel support, which has gotten quite good lately with the IGEL Ready program and working with those vendors and their hardware. So I don't see that as often. But just knowing how to get to it, and certainly if you get to a jam, you're just like, you know what, we're just going to reset and how to get there. But it's not coming up as often as far as partners or customers asking. So.
Well, how about, so I'll take customers out of the equation and put you, the sales engineer / the guy labbing stuff up all the time and building it and breaking it. And that's important for our listeners, right? They should be building and breaking, at least the guys we talk to the most. This is very valuable to them.
Yeah, it's a regular thing. If I just want to like, especially if something like a eval device or whatever, just, completely, let's just go back. That boot menu option, is valuable. It's quick, it's easy. Hit the escape key. We'll get into that here, but I would say if you're building your IGEL skill set, definitely understand this, and then everything else kind of builds from there.
Yeah. So Seb, I hit play on your video, and I don't know if you have it broken up into chunks the way you normally do, but let's talk through.
Yeah.
Let's talk through. Yes. Yep.
Sorry, so the approach was more to describe the use case where each feature of the boot menu is needed. So one of the, I would say, the most common use case that you want to reset a factory defaults a device. So let's assume that you deploy the configuration to a UD Pocket. So the USB stick where the address is installed on, and from where you can boot from. For whatever reason, the device is not coming up, or is not working like expected, or is not delivering the experience that you want, that you expect from IGEL OS. In specific cases, we recommend to you to reset that specific device to factory defaults to be sure that no misconfiguration were made, all configurations were deployed and not removed, or let's say, just make a clean reinstall to start from a clean base. That's where the reset to factory defaults is jumping in. And that's the reason why I'm putting in that on the first setting, on the first top of the topic, even if it's not the order of the video, it's one of the most common use cases for the boot menu.
Yeah. And an example would be like you had a support situation, and yes, I trust you, Mr. Administrator, you've done nothing wrong, but do you mind resetting it to factory defaults and let's build it from step one?
Exactly. especially if you think about configuration that are applying to the custom command section. Don't want to go too deep, but just saying that you can deploy a lot of Linux commands and Linux scripts, Linux tweaks via the custom command field. And sometime, and that's the situation that I had just yesterday, where a customer was still using a custom command relating to automatic Wi-Fi and LAN switch. So turn off the Wi-Fi as soon as the LAN is connected, or turn on the Wi-Fi as soon as the LAN is not connected. Yeah. That's a feature that we included since 11.06, if I remember right, in our firmware, so there was no need for a custom command anymore. And both commands were creating a kind of network loop. And that's where we are saying, hey, start from scratch, start from reset to factory defaults, just assign what you need. So basically language, the remote setting for the VNC viewer, and that's it. Yeah. And all the rest should be done then afterwards, step by step, and checking where the issue is coming from.
That's right. You start from a known good state.
Yeah, exactly. So you will not really brick the device. I mean, even if it can happen, but in most cases, resetting to factory defaults gives you, I would say, to 99% your device back, and start from scratch then to check where the issue is coming from.
Yeah, and make one change at a time.
Yeah, exactly. Just step by step and checking, because we all know that it applies to Citrix policies, it applies to Active Directory policies, it applies also to IGEL. If you create policies after policies after policies after years, and maybe different administrators went through the same tool and had different approaches of deploying settings, sometimes it can be a little bit messy to find out the root cause of a specific behavior. And that's where the reset to factory defaults, that you can also perform via the UMS, obviously, but can also be done locally to say, hey, I don't even want to touch my UMS. I want to test everything locally to be sure that I have no alt policy deployed somewhere in my UMS. And that's where the reset to factory defaults would definitely help you a lot.
Yeah, I have an Andyism for that, and that is, around my house, we move every 2 to 3 years. That helps keep the closet clean, because every couple of years we clean out. Whether I would have done that, I would have done it had we not moved. But resetting to a brand new location, anyway, you get my point. All right, so your slide here says factory defaults. Second one is check for errors on OS hardware level. You may really have a problem. You may really have found a bug with a piece of driver or whatever, and getting to factory defaults. If that still happens, now it's probably really is something. The third one is recover device from misconfiguration. How could that ever happen? Joke. Add custom boot commands. Add custom boot commands, or, and what you talked about a minute ago, remove custom boot commands and start all over. IGEL is extremely powerful, which what comes with power, right?
Yeah.
Responsibility.
That's right. So Seb, I'm going to hit play here, and we'll walk through what's happening with the factory reset scenario pieces.
Sure. So before starting into the different feature sets, just be aware that we have, if we speak about our IGEL hardware, we have also our BIOS setting, which is accessible by pressing the del button on the keyboard. So also press button. So we're not speaking about the BIOS in that case, but really about the boot menu. So the only thing that you have to do to access the boot menu is to reboot the device, and then hitting the escape button on your keyboard. The escape button will then,
you got to go through a whole lecture here on the difference between BIOS and bootstraps and boot partitions and boot files. Okay, maybe not here, but if we're talking about that and you don't know the difference between those things, maybe an A+ certification from CompTIA wouldn't be a bad thing to go get.
I was gonna say, we were thinking the same thing. That one you showed me, I think, in an earlier podcast from years. It seemed like it was last year. You mentioned that whole thing is now free. Go take that course free. It gives you a fundamental background in the hardware piece. And so we're going to assume our audience is fairly well educated, but it would be good to kind of go back and review some of that stuff from time to time.
Well, the thing is, right, if this is all about software these days, but that hardware interface, that basic input-output system, aka BIOS, that thing still matters. If you really want to be great in this industry, you got to know that stuff too.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting for me as I began to understand more about Linux, certainly working at IGEL in the last several years, Linux is a kernel, and there's IGEL basically has taken the mainstream kernel and kind of made it our own, because we do modify it for our own use, especially when working with other hardware vendors, something like that. So, but generally speaking, we base it off that mainline kernel and try to stay up to speed with that. But and that certainly allows us to add hardware support for various devices that are out there. But if you are, repurposing something or trying a UD Pocket on whatever, and you're running into issues, going into this boot menu option to see what's going on would be very helpful. And hopefully it will tell you exactly what the problem is.
So not to go down that route too far, but I guess I could argue that Linux is still the kernel. It's just the operating system you put around that kernel is what IGEL is really modifying, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, obviously, Linux being open source. I mean, IGEL has basically created its own distribution based on, Ubuntu and Debian pieces and something like that. But all wrapped around that fundamental kernel. And we've talked about this before. Microsoft has a kernel.
Well, that's just it. Right? I was going to make the joke. You don't know this, but Windows 11 is still the Windows NT kernel.
Windows NT, like probably 7.0 now or whatever. But
1008 or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So Seb, I'm hit play here again. It looks like you've rebooted the machine and you're using virtual here, or are you? Is this?
In that case, that's really the boot manager of my hypervisors. In that case, it's a VMware workstation. So just go 1 second later or two, and then you will see the IGEL boot menu. It's just because it will hit with the same key. So that's really just a normal boot process from your endpoint. In my case, a virtual one. Yeah. And just right after that, a couple of seconds later, you will see the IGEL boot menu.
Well, I think this is important. What you're showing here is actually important, especially if you're dealing with like a UD Pocket or something, or you've got a multi-boot machine. So what you're saying is we need to pick the right partition to boot from. And then once we get to that, we're going to be able to tell it, okay, do this in this IGEL partition.
Exactly. So there are definitely keystrokes out there for specific pieces of hardware that might also grab an escape key. I guess it was some Acer laptops a couple of years ago who had the same keystroke for accessing the boot menu. So it was sometimes hard to explain to a customer that he has to wait 1 or 2 seconds just after the BIOS was loaded or the UEFI BIOS was loaded to then switch to the regular boot menu. And sometimes it's so fast that you cannot even enter the boot menu. So it's a little bit tricky from time to time, but I would say 90% of the cases it's pretty handy. So as soon as you hit the escape button, you will get a menu where the standard process would be to have a quiet boot. Quiet boot is what we are doing on every boot up process. So as soon as you hit the power button of your endpoint to send out a wake on LAN package to the NIC, it will boot in quiet mode. So we just boot, you will see the IGEL bootloader, was that from your own company, and then see whatever you defined on your IGEL desktop. So the desktop or login mask. But then in the second step, we have, which is extremely important for debugging reasons, it's a verbose boot. Verbose boot means that the typical use case, at least for me, is graphical process units or GPU issues, where customer is just saying, hey, I did boot it up the last firmware on my UD Pocket on a new piece of hardware, I'm just getting a black screen. I mean, there are also other reasons for that, but I'm always trying to start with, can you press Control Alt F12, F11 or F10 to change to the command line interface? If I have someone who is a little bit nerdy, if I have no one who is nerdy, I would just say boot into the verbose boot and tell me with a picture made from your cell phone where the device hangs. And usually it will hang on specific driver that cannot be loaded, or it will show that, I don't know, a specific interrupt cannot be loaded. And that gives me then a first advice where I can look at. That's why the verbose boot is definitely happy.
So Seb, I'm so old, I used to have to go find a real camera to do that.
Not sure about that. I'm pretty sure you already have a cell phone, right?
No, I mean, I literally remember getting a camera and watching the thing boot so I could send support where it broke, or some logs or both.
As soon as you don't put that on the I don't know how to say it in English, but on the copy machine, it's all good.
True story. All right. So Seb, so that's the verbose boot. And what that means is it's logging, it's showing you every step of the process, and you see the last thing before it goes, upside down. And that's where we know to start looking. So that's the verbose. The next one is VESA, VESA only boot.
Yeah.
Chris alluded to it. Tell us what that one does.
So the VESA is, how should I call it? To be honest, I have to double check on Google what VESA means in detail, but it was related to a simple graphical driver set, which is not enabling a lot of cool features like multi-monitor or extremely high resolution. It will just boot with a extremely limited subsets of driver features. So you will not get hardware acceleration or all that stuff. It will just boot like the safe boot on Windows in former times, where you could boot the Windows in a, let's say, limited driver loaded registry, Hives loaded environment. And that's what the VESA boot is doing. So even if some GPU drivers are not there because you are using the latest 11th generation of Intel processors, you would then get at least something to show. And that's where the VESA is helping, because then you can at least check hardware informations inside of IGEL OS. And that's something which would not be able to do if you just start into the Verbose boot, because Verbose will just show you where it hangs, but you cannot do something else than leaving it. Yep. And I'm just checking in parallel what VESA is.
Yeah, I put it in the chat. It's video electronic standards. Standards is the highlighted word for me. Association. From certainly my days as a Windows admin, equivalent, I think, for this often is if you're booting up into the Windows boot option, it's the oh gosh, I'm trying to remember. It's the one where it's not networked or whatever, but at least it gets you to that desktop because something got messed up and you need to be able to fix it. But the graphics won't come up in HD. It'll be something very, very minimalist. But the long and short of it is there's standards, right? I mean, you should be able to switch to this and boot and get to something. It may not look pretty, but there's, we're dealing with electronics across, various countries, and there are some standards, and this is one of those that, kernel hardware makers or software makers, they should all, abide to at some point. So,
I mean, think about the. Think about the amount of
one thing. I was just going to say I've used this when testing a virtual machine, when something on the virtualization layer wasn't working, and I went to this just to see what was going on, and that brought me to the desktop, whereas I was looking at a black screen or something before. So it's even helpful in that sometimes.
I mean, think about the amount of code that goes into just displaying a 4K picture on the screen. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong. This is your get out of jail free card.
I like that.
I have to simplify things for myself to understand it. All right, I think we're done with that
Monopoly.
Seb, the next section is emergency boot setup only. I got to admit, this one I never understood. What is this one?
It's pretty easy to explain. It will start in the same mode like the VESA only boot mode, but it will give you not the full access to the IGEL OS ecosystem, only to the IGEL setup itself. So let's imagine that you made a configuration locally and you misconfigured something, the display settings, maybe some network configurations or whatever, or custom commands, and you want to roll them back without resetting the device to factory default. That's where you would just get the IGEL setup on the desktop, nothing more. So you can just change a configuration that you made locally, obviously not one that you deployed over IGEL UMS, because that would be a profile then. But you can definitely change configurations locally. So it applies if you're testing a custom partition, like an example. And let's imagine on update, and you tested something locally, you entered the wrong update path in your system update, firmware update section. and you want to roll that back because you want to change obviously the host name or the port or whatever, that's where the emergency boot would help you to roll back that setting.
Yeah. Quick question for you. If you translate this into German, does it make more sense? Because here's my thing, right? When I see
Yeah.
this, I think about the initial setup, like setup, not settings only.
Okay, understood. It's called abgesicherte Modus, if I'm right. So it's, I would say it makes even less sense if you translate it in German.
Okay.
So not sure where it comes from, but I know that it was called like that since OS 5, if I remember right. So it's maybe something that we just need to rethink a little bit.
Yeah, because when I ran into this the other week, I thought about this in the form of like the initial setup wizard, not the settings only section.
Yeah, that's right. Might be a little bit misleading.
Chris, any comments on this one?
Sorry, I'd gone on mute there for a second. I've used it before, similar thing, right? Something is not right. You don't want to necessarily reset the thing, but maybe you're messing around with something local in the setup. This might be a good option, I think, if you are not under management with the UMS server and you're making settings local. Maybe you did something, you put yourself in appliance mode, right? You're like, ah, crud, now I can't get out of it. This might be a good option to go back in, turn that off, and get back to the IGEL desktop. I would certainly play around with that, test it out, but that's a good one to keep in the back pocket.
So Seb, the next one that you go to in the video is fail-safe boot with CRC, another acronym. Check. What's the CRC stand for?
CRC is a sector check. So checking is a checksum of your sectors of your hard disk, and at least where we have written something on it will be checked. So that applies especially if you think of old hardware that you repurpose with the IGEL OS. Not speaking only about the UD Pocket, but really speaking about the OSC, so the OS creator, where you install the IGEL OS on all the hardware, like an old thin client from HP or Dell or whatever, who is already running since 8, 5, 10 years maybe, where the SSD DOM is getting old and might have some issues with bad sectors. Yeah. That's where it will help you to check if something needs to be repaired. And when I say something, I really mean something, because you can start at a specific partition, which cannot be started anymore because the partition checksum is not matching anymore. It can be a feature where you just activated the feature in your IGEL setup and it's not working. Even if it's working on other hardware with exactly the same piece of profiles. And that's where the CRC check is coming in and helping you to sort at least the hardware layer out and say, okay, we might have a defective SSD DOM there. Or if you think about the UD Pocket, a UD Pocket which is connected 24 hours, 7 days a week with a specific piece of hardware, especially if it's not turned off every night, like an example, it might, in specific cases, getting quite hot. And that specific behavior over a couple of years, couple of months can cause, in specific cases, a bad sector on your, so defective sector on your UD Pocket. And that's where the CRC check can also help you to recover a device which is not working at all anymore.
So Seb, I love this. I need this. This just prevent me from having to go get a Linux utility to do this. So it'll fix the sector or mark it as unusable. Is that true?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's awesome.
And we'll try to, at least for the sectors where we are working on. So we will not check every sector of the disk, to be honest. So just to be clear, we're not doing that. We are just relying on the part of the disk where we have written data on. So on the UD Pocket, it will be the 2 GB partition, or on the on a piece of hardware, it would be whatever you define in your settings. So just to set the expectation right, it would not replace the ultimate boot CD or something like that, not at all. But it would just rely on our operating system installed on foreign hardware.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is nerdy. This is old school. This is hardware stuff. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay. The next section talks about reset to factory defaults. I think you covered that in the beginning. We covered very well the idea that that's important.
Yeah. Just one thing, because I'm covering that in the video too. You already mentioned that just right at the beginning of your of our discussion. Obviously, we cannot reset any device to reset to factory defaults just by pressing escape in the boot menu. That would cause also a security issue. So what we are doing there, we are blocking, we are protecting specific pieces of the boot menu with a password. So if you cannot enter the boot menu the factory defaults feature, and you will be asked for a password, it is highly probable that you entered a password for your administrator user inside of your IGEL UMS for this endpoint. It's not every time, but in 99% the same password as you entered for the IGEL setup. So let's imagine that you're on your IGEL OS, you press Ctrl+S for opening the IGEL setup, and then you would be asked for a password. And that's in 99%, like I said, the same password as you have entered in the IGEL OS setup. So the administrator user for your endpoint. And that's needed for resetting a device to factory defaults from the boot menu itself.
If you did not set one, is it just enter or is it root?
Yeah. It will just enter directly without asking you for anything.
Okay, so it doesn't even stop and ask you.
No, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, the situation we had the other night, we were at a basketball game. We wanted to do a demo with IGEL, and the customer had set it with a password. It was awesome because we couldn't fix it. We couldn't break it other than just totally reinstalling it. And we called them and said, "Hey, can you give us your password?" Like, no, this is our domain admin password. We can't do that. Said, okay, I can't argue with that one. I love the security angle. Chris, one more chance here to comment on factory restore before we get to probably the one that's going to take us the rest of the call, and that is custom boot options or commands. Chris, anything on this topic?
No, I think certainly in your lab, test it out, get familiar with it, know what happens when you go through it. It should be part of the Swiss Army knife of learning IGEL. Because at some point you're going to need it.
So you will definitely need it. So Seb, your last section right here, I think, should be about the custom commands. Let's jump into that. That's probably a never-ending conversation. There's unlimited options.
And that's unfortunately, and at the same time, luckily, the exact right term for that. It can take hours, but honestly, in now 8 years of IGEL and I don't know, 1.5 years now in the IGEL community team, I just had 5 to 10 times to teach someone how to use that specific custom command section. For one reason, if you want to test it for one shot, it's a great solution. So let's imagine a use case where I went through. You have a specific piece of touchpad in your device, in your laptop. And it's not recognized at all by the IGEL OS. Whatever setting you made in your driver setting inside of IGEL OS, it couldn't work. So you go to Google and asking, hey, Google, what can I do with Synaptics, whatever touchpad and Ubuntu? And then you will, in most cases, get something that you have to enter the grep bootloader boot menu and enter a specific boot command to get it working. Obviously, it's not something that you can do from the command line on IGEL OS because most of our partitions are write protected, or if they're not write protected, are non-persistent. So whatever you would do in the operating system will code that it will be gone after a reboot. And that also applies to boot commands. And that's where the custom boot command section of our boot menu is helping you. So if you want to test a specific boot command, for touchpad, maybe for a specific power state, for SCPI states, that's where the custom boot command will jump in and help you to test your option. I mean, it's not something that you will do in the graphical user interface. It's really related to command line. And obviously you could, in theory, break the device, but since it is not, it's not written forever, you can always go back and remove it. But that's where the custom boot command helped me when it came to touchpad drivers and to graphical user interface drivers that I need to tweak it.
So Seb, you could basically put software on the system, invoke that software, the custom boot command, at this point in the process, if that's when you needed it to show up.
You cannot Yes, obviously you can integrate into the operating system, yes, but you cannot call it in that moment, because at the moment, custom partitions, like an example, would be the standard use case where you could put some drivers, etc., over a reboot and be persistent, will not be loaded until that moment. So it would not invoke specific drivers, but you can tweak existing drivers inside of the operating system or kernel drivers that are included in the kernel.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense for the audience. I know it's a little bit theoretical, but like I said, it will not happen that much that you will deal with that option. More with reset to factory defaults, in my opinion, and Verbose boot. But just in case that you know that you can do that on iOS, so we are pretty flexible.
So Seb, I'm trying to walk through the video here. And I've actually done this once before. So you're entering, so it's just flat out taking a command or a script that you write, or a command that calls a script that you've written, and whatever logic you put into that script can be invoked via the custom boot command. Exactly. Yeah. I forget why I did that, but there was some reason. I think it was like you guys were talking about earlier. It was a version that we were evaluating, and we needed to try to call up something. Actually, you know what? I think it might have been related to screensavers. Actually, we were doing something with screensavers, and we needed to go ahead and run a command that listened in the background to kick in the screensaver for some odd reason. I don't remember what it was.
No, that was the conditional command. That's a really cool feature. We could definitely make a vlog on that too. You mean that as soon as the screensaver starts, it will invoke a Linux command. That's a conditional command. That's a cool one. That's right. That's what it was. Yep. Yep. Well, I guess we've covered it. We've kind of left Chris out here for the last few minutes. Chris, any comments around custom boot commands?
You know, honestly, I have never used this feature, and that doesn't surprise me. There's so much about IGEL that honestly, almost every day or every week, there's something new. So I was just listening to some of the use cases there. I may have to play around with that a little bit more, but I'm glad it's there. I just never had to use it in my experience. So I'd certainly love to, as we post this blog, if others have experiences where they've used that, certainly would love to hear more.
Yeah, the thing that got me on IGEL was the multiple versions of the Citrix Workspace app. It used to be called Program Neighborhood, Program Neighborhood Agent, that stuff, Receiver. But it's you know, I laugh when I hear other thin client vendors, aka thin client operating system vendors, talking about being on par with IGEL. You guys have just, I don't know how it happened, but tons of features and controllability and things went into this product before I ever discovered it. It's light years ahead of everybody else. It's causing some headache also sometimes, because we have so much different solutions, including the operating system, that it's sometimes hard to keep an overview. But yes, yeah. it makes it even more agile. That was spoken like a real engineer, Seb. give them the good, but keep them honest with the bad as well. And that's just the reality of having so much capability. And that's why we're doing these podcasts. That's why you're doing the videos. It's awesome. Right. All right, well, guys, I think we're at the end here. I appreciate yet another podcast and you taking the time out of your day. Chris traveling, myself traveling, Seb at home in his lair, but excited about traveling. Hell yeah. We'll do it again in a couple weeks. Hopefully, yes. Awesome. I will be there.
You guys have a great one.
All right, guys. Thanks. You too, guys.
See ya.